Welcome to the debate. What if the politicians negotiating for peace in the Middle East actually benefit the most when the underlying conflict stays completely unresolved?
Yeah, it is a fascinating and honestly kind of terrifying question. Today, we're examining the recent diplomatic agreement between the United States and Iran.
Right, and to some people, this is a genuine breakthrough, a desperately needed intervention that pulls us back from the brink of a catastrophic regional war.
But to others, it is nothing more than a temporary illusion. Basically, a political magic trick that deliberately delays the inevitable while keeping the structural tensions fully intact.
Exactly. I take the position that this agreement, despite its obvious flaws, is a highly pragmatic and necessary step. It fundamentally mitigates immediate, severe threats, specifically military escalation, and devastating economic shocks. And, it's driven by raw, undeniable mutual necessity.
And my perspective is grounded in structural realism. For those studying international relations, that essentially means looking at the world as an anarchic system. There's no global police force, right?
Right. States are entirely on their own.
Exactly. They are on their own for survival, which means they are obsessed with power and leverage, regardless of what they say at diplomatic summits. From that lens, this agreement isn't a peace deal. It is a managed pause.
A managed pause. Okay.
Yeah. It deliberately obscures reality by applying a temporary political timeout while failing entirely to address the root causes of the U.S.-Iran conflict. We are trapped in a cyclical pattern where these so-called historic agreements inevitably devolve right back into sanctions and military threats.
And I argue we have to evaluate this agreement not against some utopian ideal of eternal friendship, but against the actual alternative staring us in the face.
Which you see as immediate conflict.
Precisely. The alternative to this diplomatic deal is not a peaceful status quo. The alternative is immediate, violent escalation. When we talk about escalation in this region, we aren't just talking about harsh rhetoric. We are talking about asymmetric retaliation.
Right, proxy warfare and asymmetric tactics.
Yes. For anyone tracking global security, that doesn't mean matching an army tank for tank. It means leveraging specific geographic advantages, like picture fleets of cheap, fast swarm boats armed with explosives.
Which are explicitly designed to threaten those massive, sluggish global oil tankers.
Exactly. Navigating the incredibly narrow geographic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, a disruption there doesn't just sink a ship, it sends massive macroeconomic shocks rippling through global energy markets overnight.
But you're framing this as a binary choice, right? Like it is either this specific deal or an apocalyptic war. Have you considered what happens when temporary solutions are aggressively marketed to the public as permanent fixes?
I think diplomacy is a process, not a magic wand.
Sure, but calling this a peace deal creates a highly dangerous false sense of security. If we look closely at the text of the agreement and the broader structural dynamics, the core incompatibilities remain entirely untouched.
Well, trust isn't a prerequisite for a functional agreement. Mutual interest is.
But look at the competing interests. The United States' primary security imperative is halting Iran's nuclear ambitions and curtailing its regional influence. Iran's primary imperative is absolute state sovereignty, regime survival, and the total dismantling of the Western sanctions architecture.
Which they desperately need.
Right, but these are mutually exclusive goals. Therefore, both nations are trapped in a predictable pattern. They sign a paper to relieve immediate pressure, but because the underlying distrust remains completely unchanged, they use the resulting timeout to quietly rebuild their leverage.
You use the term managed pause as a pejorative, but, in diplomatic history, managed pauses have quite literally saved the world.
You're talking about the Cold War.
I am. Look at the historical precedents. Take the strategic arms limitation talks, SALT I and SALT II, during the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear material to end human civilization multiple times over.
Right, the stakes were existential.
And the leaders signing those agreements deeply despised each other. There was zero trust. The underlying ideological conflict between capitalism and communism was utterly unresolved. Yet those managed pauses established verification regimes, cooled tensions, and prevented nuclear annihilation.
It is a fair historical comparison, but I think it falls apart when you look at the actual mechanics of the conflict. The US-Soviet dynamic was stabilized by mutually assured destruction.
Mad? Yeah.
Exactly, which is a perfectly symmetrical existential threat. If one side fired, both sides died. The US-Iran dynamic is highly asymmetrical.
But a pause still stops the immediate threat.
It does, but when you enforce a managed pause in an asymmetrical conflict, the pause doesn't freeze the status quo. It actually allows the weaker party to develop asymmetric advantages, while the stronger party is bound by the treaty's red tape.
So you're saying the pause inherently favors Tehran?
Yes. It's less like putting out a fire and more like installing a pressure relief valve on a boiler. You stop the immediate explosion today, but you leave the fire burning intensely right underneath. And the danger here is that Western democracies, which are highly responsive to domestic anti-war sentiment, will treat the paper as a genuine resolution and just drop their guard.
While Iran continues to fund proxy networks.
Precisely. They use the economic cover of the agreement to fund militias in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. They don't fight the U.S. directly, you know. They bleed them through 1,000 cuts. We've seen this exact pattern of failure in past agreements. The ink dries, sanctions are lifted, the crisis fades from the news cycle, and the root causes just fester in the dark.
I hear that, but I think they're completely discounting the economic reality. You're suggesting the pause only benefits the asymmetric actor. But look at the massive structural economic forces that keep bringing both of these actors back to the negotiating table.
You mean the sanctions architecture?
Yeah. The sanctions heavily deployed by the U.S. don't just isolate Tehran. They have profound impacts on global market stability. Yes, Iran desperately requires economic relief. Their inflation rates are staggering, right?
Oh, absolutely. The devaluation of their currency creates intense internal pressure.
People literally take to the streets when they can't afford bread. But global markets also demand predictability. When a quarter of the world's oil supply is threatened by regional escalation, ordinary citizens in the West pay the price at the pump.
And high energy prices drive inflation.
Exactly. And inflation dictates domestic elections. Both sides are bound by these economic chains. Ordinary citizens, whether they live in Tehran or Chicago, want economic growth and lower energy prices. They don't want ideological victories. The mutual economic interest in keeping this deal alive is robust, and it's highly motivating.
Okay, but that economic relief is completely dependent on technical compliance, which frankly brings up a massive blind spot in your pragmatism argument. Economic mutual interests in international relations are highly expendable when domestic political winds shift.
How so?
Well, you mentioned global markets and inflation. But what happens when an administration changes in Washington? A new president might calculate that tearing up the agreement and reapplying maximum pressure secures a crucial voting bloc.
Even if it ignores the macroeconomic consequences.
Exactly. Or consider Tehran. If the Iranian leadership feels internal dissent rising, they routinely discard economic rationality in favor of nationalist, anti-Western posturing just to consolidate power. And let's dive into the actual technical details here.
The nuclear monitoring.
Yes, because the economic relief is supposedly contingent on Iran not building a nuclear weapon. Have you looked at the sheer technical nightmare of actually monitoring Iran's nuclear program?
I have. And the verification regimes built into these agreements are some of the most intrusive and technologically advanced in human history. We are talking about highly sophisticated electronic seals, 24/7 camera surveillance.
Intrusive on paper, yes. In reality, evaluating whether the technical compliance holds is nearly impossible in a closed society.
But the IAEA has unprecedented access under these frameworks.
Right, the International Atomic Energy Agency. But they are trying to monitor trace uranium particles in vast, deeply buried underground facilities, like Fordo.
The facility built into the mountain.
Exactly, facilities built specifically to withstand bunker-busting bombs. And we are talking about advanced centrifuge cascades, specifically the IR-6 models. Let's break down why that is so terrifying for anyone studying this, because enrichment isn't a linear scale.
Right, it's an exponential curve.
It's a non-linear curve, yeah. The effort required to take natural uranium, which is less than 1% fissile material, and spin it up to 20% takes massive, resource-intensive industrial effort. It takes a very long time.
But once you hit 20%,
Once you have a stockpile of 20%, spinning that up to 60% is significantly faster. And going from 60% to the 90% needed for a nuclear weapon, that takes almost no time at all. You are essentially standing inches from the finish line.
I acknowledge the technical threat, absolutely.
And the real challenge is that the monitoring equipment, the cameras, the electronic seals you mentioned, they can simply be blinded or disconnected the moment Tehran decides the economic benefits of the deal are no longer sufficient. When you base an agreement on economic relief in exchange for technical compliance, and that compliance can be revoked in an afternoon, the agreement is built on sand.
Well, your argument assumes verification must be flawless to be effective, which I think ignores the reality of intelligence gathering. The technical challenges are immense, yes. Centrifuge technology is compact. Facilities are hardened.
Highly hardened.
Right, but the presence of IAEA inspectors, even with heavily restricted access, provides a baseline of intelligence and early warning that simply does not exist without the agreement.
Even if they turn off the cameras?
If the cameras are turned off, that action in itself is a massive flashing red light. It's a primary indicator of breakout. Without the deal, the cameras aren't there to begin with.
That's a fair point.
The baseline is zero visibility. So we return to the core pragmatism of international relations. Having 50% visibility into an adversary's nuclear program is exponentially better than having 0% visibility. The economic relief provided to Iran is simply the price the global community pays for that visibility. It's a calculated transaction.
A transaction that repeatedly fails, though, because of the most disruptive variable in international relations: domestic political survival.
The audience cost.
Yes, what political scientists call domestic audience cost. If economic logic dictates peace and technical monitoring is supposedly manageable, like you say, why do these agreements continually collapse? Think about how a politician builds their brand.
By posturing against an enemy.
Exactly. If a leader builds their entire identity on being tough on a specific enemy, compromising with that adversary costs them their political base at home. Hardliners in Washington gain immense political capital and campaign funding by appearing hawkish.
By portraying Iran as an unrelenting existential threat.
Right, a threat that only they are tough enough to handle. And conversely, hardliners in Tehran gain their entire revolutionary legitimacy by resisting the Great Satan. If the conflict is actually resolved, both of these groups lose their primary political utility.
Wait, but are you seriously suggesting a U.S. president would risk the immense political fallout of a controversial Iran deal just for a temporary polling bump? Or that Iranian leaders would risk looking weak in front of their hardliners just to play a long game?
Yes, that is exactly the dynamic.
But if domestic politicians truly benefit more from permanent tension, why would they risk the intense domestic backlash of signing this agreement at all? Think about the political capital it costs a U.S. president to sign a deal with Iran. Doesn't the very existence of the signature on that document prove that the pressure for stability occasionally outweighs the political utility of conflict?
No, I argue they sign it precisely because it is a managed pause. They aren't risking their political survival, they are optimizing it.
By kicking the can down the road?
Yes. By signing a temporary deal, the U.S. president gets to claim a massive diplomatic victory, lower gas prices right before an election, and look like a global peacemaker. The Iranian leadership gets an immediate influx of unfrozen assets, which they desperately need to quiet domestic riots.
And pay their security forces.
Exactly. But, and this is the critical mechanism, because the deal purposefully leaves the core disagreements unresolved, both sides get to keep their enemy.
Wow. So you're saying they actively avoid true compromise?
They actively avoid it because a permanent resolution ends the game. Unresolved conflict guarantees their political survival for the next decade. They get the immediate cash and the temporary polling bump today, while carefully preserving the underlying antagonism for future campaigns.
Okay, but that preservation of antagonism, even if highly calculated and cynical, still results in a period where missiles aren't flying, right? It results in a period where global shipping lanes are actually secure.
Temporarily secure.
Yes, but we have to separate the cynical motivations of the actors from the
tangible, physical benefits of the outcome. Even if a leader signs a peace agreement purely for selfish electoral reasons, the peace is still real for the citizens who don't have to send their children to fight in a war.
I understand the human element of that. Absolutely.
It's about what we are buying.
If you install that pressure relief valve on the boiler, you have made a pragmatic decision for today.
Right.
But if you convince yourself the boiler is no longer fundamentally flawed and you stop monitoring the pressure building up elsewhere, you are going to be completely blindsided when the entire system explodes.
So you see it as a mechanism of complacency?
Yes. They lull the international community into a false sense of security. Instead of using the managed pause to tirelessly work on the structural issues like regional hegemony, proxy warfare, and long-term security architectures, policymakers just pat themselves on the back.
They declare a historic victory and move on.
And move their attention to the next global crisis. And so the pattern of failure repeats. We saw it with previous frameworks in the region. We will inevitably see it with this one.
Well, my position remains one of cautious optimism. I maintain that this deal, despite the immense technical challenges of nuclear verification and the undeniable cynicism of domestic politics we just talked about, is a triumph of necessary pragmatism.
Even with the historical pattern of failure?
Yes, because diplomacy, even when it is deeply imperfect, even when it's driven by raw economic necessity rather than mutual trust, remains vastly preferable to the catastrophic macroeconomic and human costs of warfare. It prevents immediate economic shocks, it lowers the temperature in a highly volatile region, and it keeps the lines of communication open. We cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good when the alternative is regional devastation.
And my position remains one of cautious skepticism. I warn that citizens and students of international relations must not confuse a politically convenient postponement for a genuine resolution. The structural incompatibilities between these two nations have not been solved. They have merely been swept under the rug for the duration of this current news cycle.
Until the next election.
Right. Until we address the mechanics of how conflict serves the domestic political survival of leadership on both sides, these agreements will remain fragile, cyclical, and ultimately temporary. We must maintain our analytical rigor and recognize this for what it really is, a political timeout.
Yet, despite our different analytical frameworks, I think we've actually found a vital point of convergence today. We both agree fundamentally that this agreement is built entirely on raw necessity, not friendship.
Definitely not friendship.
And we agree that blindly celebrating the deal is as foolish as automatically dismissing it. The international system is driven by states acting in their own self-interest, and right now, it is in both their interests to pause.
Exactly. And we also agree that the true test of this diplomatic endeavor is not the signing of the paper. Signing a document is the easiest part of international relations.
Very true.
The real challenge is keeping it alive against the immense gravity of domestic politics, shifting global alliances, and the inevitable technical disputes over compliance. Listeners must continue to scrutinize the material and look past the headlines, constantly questioning whether their leaders are actually solving crises or merely managing them for their own political gain.
The structure is built, and people are crossing it today. But we must remain vigilant, watching the shifting ground beneath it. Whether this agreement ultimately goes down in history as a true diplomatic breakthrough that shifted the paradigm, or just another forgotten chapter in a long, unresolved rivalry, is a story that is still being written.
Absolutely.
We leave it to you to decide. Thank you for joining us for this rigorous exchange of ideas. Until next time.